Well, just as I predicted last week, Black Widow took a spectacular dump in weekend number 2. And what does this mean for Disney going forward in its relationship with the box office? Because this story today reminded me of a story from almost 4 years ago, right before The Last Jedi came out. We're going to talk about that and what that means going forward, because I think there's more to this than meets the eye. Here we go. Renegade Online. So about 4 years ago now, an article from the Wall Street Journal came out entitled "Disney Lays Down the Law for Theaters" on Star Wars: The Last Jedi. Let's talk about that for a second. Exhibitors claim the studio's top secret terms are the most onerous they have ever seen. The box office domination of Star Wars franchise has given Walt Disney an unprecedented power over the nation's movie theaters, and before exhibitors can begin screening Star Wars: The Last Jedi this December, they must first commit to a top-secret set of terms that numerous theater owners say are the most onerous they have ever seen, where Disney will receive about 65% of ticket revenue from the film, a new high for a Hollywood studio. Disney is also requiring theaters to show the movie in their largest auditorium for at least 4 weeks. Ignoring the terms carries an unusual penalty. If a theater violates any condition of the distribution agreement, Disney can take an additional 5% cut, bringing the studio's total haul to 70% of sales on a movie likely to gross more than $500 million at the domestic box. Now, just a quick aside. I think we all remember what happened with that. The movie did perform admirably, although not up to expectations by financial analysts years before when Disney bought Lucasfilm. Of course, The Last Jedi was a complete dud when it came to anything Star Wars, and we wish we would all forget it at this point because it was a complete travesty and a mess. And it signaled the end of Disney Star Wars at that point, and especially when the subsequent movie came out with Rise of Palpatine and did even more poorly than did The Last Jedi compared to the initial entry in the series, The Force Awakens, just in 2015, 2 years before The Last Jedi. So, back to the article. The case of The Last Jedi highlights a perpetual but growing tension between the business partners that bring movies to the public, studios, and theaters. Negotiations between the two parties have grown pitched as Disney has become one of the most powerful studios in Hollywood. Theaters have lost their leverage as box office sales fall. Box office revenues down 5% so far this year. The decline is accelerating plans at other studios to narrow the theatrical window and make movies available for home viewing sooner. But Disney said it wants to preserve the current theatrical model, making the studio an even more indispensable supplier for exhibitors over the long term. So, there you go. Disney committing that they want, they're committed to theaters. They're committed to theaters right up until they launch Disney Plus, and the lockdowns happen. And even though the theaters, by and large, at this point are all open and functional, we still have day-and-date releases on Disney Plus, including Premier Access for the extra $30, which didn't go over so well with Mulan, didn't go over terribly well with Raya and the Last Dragon, Cruella, and now Disney is touting this $60 million on Disney Plus in its opening weekend through Premier Access with Black Widow as being a tremendous success. But is it really? Is it really? And what is Disney doing with this? I wonder. Those days are gone for Disney. This was back in the day when Disney movies were pretty much guaranteed hits. Everything that Disney released, this was something that most other studios at the time, and even currently, really can't do. They can't try to force a studio's or a movie theater company's hand for 60+% of the gross box office receipts because there's no telling what movies are going to do at this point. Disney, I think, is trying to find a way to maintain their leverage over movie theaters because clearly the Last Jedi, movie theater exhibitioners were expecting something on par, even better than Force Awakens, which broke the $2 billion domestic or $2 billion worldwide box, That's what theaters were expecting. And of course, domestic theaters versus international, a little bit different. The average domestically here for a studio to take is 50 to 60% from the theater, from the grosses, Overseas, however, it's closer to 40% on average. Of course, with China coming in worse, China, you only walk away with about 25%. So when you see movies like Fast and the Furious doing $400-500 million in China, the studio's taking home about 25% of that. The CCP keeps the rest. So that's a few things to bear in mind with those numbers as we move forward. But let's go back to this for a second. The dynamic that has exhibitors across the country resigning themselves to a harsh business reality. If you want to play Disney's blockbuster movies, get used to Disney's rules. Quote, they're in the most powerful position any studio has ever been in, maybe since MGM in the 30s, said one film buyer. And of course, a Disney spokesman declined any comment on the negotiations. The studio's slate of surefire hits this year, again, this is 2017, included Beauty and the Beast, Guardians of the Galaxy 2, and Thor Ragnarok coming out this weekend, and that was along with Star Wars that year. Last year, 2016, Disney accounted for 26% of all total domestic box office. So again, this goes back hat in hand with the level of power and clout that Disney has held for the last decade or so over theaters. That power seems to be waning, does it not? When we look at Black Widow's receipts, on the first weekend, Disney touts a celebratory $39 million opening Friday. But as I told you in the video last week, if you go back and you watch that video, one of the things I called to your attention was the staggering drop-off, absolutely stunning drop-off from Friday to Saturday. And yes, Friday included Thursday night previews, but typically even with that, and I showed you a side-by-side of Black Widow and the movie's box office they had been comparing it to, Doctor Strange. Doctor Strange did not have so sharp a decline. Doctor Strange was fairly leveled off throughout the weekend by comparison. Usually when you see Fridays with Thursday previews, Saturdays get kind of in the same ballpark, typically because there might be a 15 to 20% variance, but certainly 40-some-odd% drop from Friday to Saturday for Black Widow in its first weekend was definitely eye-popping. Merely because, of course, on Thursdays and Fridays, those are still work days. You know, before 5 o'clock in the afternoon, most people are still at work. So really the only opportunities to see shows on those days are in the evening. Whereas Saturday, you got a lot of families that get up, they'll go in the morning, they'll go for matinee shows, early shows, afternoon shows, and then, of course, you get the evening shows too. So Saturdays tend to be the big days for the movies on the weekends. So that really didn't happen with Black Widow. And of course, Samba TV did confirm to a degree the numbers that Disney had reported with Black Widow when it streamed, saying that Disney had received about $60 million in revenue for Black Widow through Premier Access. That would equate to, at $30 per pop, about 2 million households. Well, Samba TV, again, in the video that I did previously to this on Black Widow, did indeed confirm that about 1.1 million U.S. households did watch Black Widow its opening weekend. That would put the other 900,000 households, roughly, in international territories. The numbers kind of jive with that, so I can buy it. The problem is with those numbers, of course, is that precludes Disney from making any future sales. You know, it used to be where you'd go to the theater, you'd buy a ticket, or in the case of Disney, most of the time the families would show up. You'd have at least maybe 3 or 4 people. You'd have mom, dad, 2 kids. That's kind of an average Disney household that would show up. And maybe they'd go see the movie more than once. Well, now with Disney Premier Access, that's not happening. You know, you're buying it once and you have it. Then the people would go around and, 6 months later, they'd pick up a copy on either VHS way back in the day, Laserdisc. They'd pick it up on DVD. They'd pick it up on Blu-ray, now 4K, all the re-releases. That's probably not going to happen as much anymore. If we want to add a little bit more fuel to this fire, we have an article today from Deadline about a press release from the National Association of Theater Owners and what they had to say about Black Widow's decline and all this box office discussion that we've just been having. Surprise, surprise. NATO asks, how can a well-reviewed, well-received, highly anticipated Marvel title underperform, leading to a first weekend Friday to Saturday collapse of 41% and a 67% drop in weekend 2? NATO comes to the same conclusions as we did, Deadline, in regards to Black Widow getting her legs picked off. Piracy and Disney Plus at-home cannibalization, which impacts not just the box office, but the pick's subsequent home window as well. Well, surprise, surprise. I think that's what I've been saying for quite a while, not just with Black Widow last weekend, but in other discussions I've had on this channel about box office in general, about how I felt earlier on in the year. Warner Brothers was making a tremendous mistake with this day and date release crap on HBO Max. It just doesn't work. You're only cutting your own legs off. There's no real reason to do it. But all of them are obsessed with building up their streaming numbers because they think this everybody's going to be a big giant Netflix behemoth of streaming revenue. And it's just not realistic. It really isn't. And they have not figured this out yet. They really have not figured this out yet. It's going to take some time. So Disney theatrical day and date Disney model ignores that Premier Access revenue is not newfound money, but was pulled forward from a more traditional PVOD window, which is no longer an option, reports NATO. Despite assertions that this pandemic-era improvised release strategy was a success for Disney and the simultaneous release model, it demonstrates that an exclusive theatrical release means more revenue for all stakeholders in every cycle of the movie's life, emphasizes the NATO news drop. Very true. Very, very true. Like I was just talking about, you mess up the rentals, digital rentals or otherwise, you mess up Blu-ray and DVD sales. You mess up releases on other avenues to where a movie would be licensed out to other television networks or places like HBO or Netflix or things like that. All of that is now front-loaded in a single $30 purchase on Premier Access in the case of Disney. Doesn't work long-term. NATO goes further in specifying the lost amount of dollars for both Black Widow and Exhibition. The average number of people per household in the U.S. is 2.37. One can assume the family-oriented Disney Plus household is much larger. How much password sharing is there among Disney Plus subscribers? Well, if you listen to YouTube enough, you know it's quite prevalent. Combined with the lost theatrical revenue and foregone traditional PVOD revenue, the answer to these questions will show that the simultaneous release costs Disney money in revenue per viewer over the life of the film. I absolutely, positively agree with that and everything I've just said. This could not be better stated, and my applause to the National Association of Theater Owners for getting out here and dropping this statement for what we were discussing for the last week at least, just about Black Widow alone. Just about Black Widow alone. And what we've been discussing here on channels like this and other channels here on YouTube about the mistakes of these companies releasing these things day and date on streaming services. It was never going to work long term. Believe me, I'm a guy that has bought multiple copies of movies that I've really enjoyed over the years as the formats have changed and as the quality of the reproductions have gotten better. There's been a number of movies that I have gone to the theater to see 2 and 3 times, in some cases a lot more. But that's not going to happen now with Premier Access. What also isn't going to happen is that Disney is losing their grip over theaters to command these higher and higher shares of ticket revenues, of gross box office revenues. Why would a theater at this point agree to give Disney 60 or 65% of any movie they put out when they're going to be day and date releasing it for streaming on Disney Plus? The theater is already getting cut off at the legs. And when you look at the Disney Plus numbers they sold, that would translate to roughly around $90 million or so in box office revenues, with Disney taking maybe around 60 to 65% of that, which would put them closer back down to around 60 million, between 50 and 60 million. And with the Disney Plus streaming service, you have to remember, they really don't get to keep all of that revenue. You see, if you go through Disney Plus, or if you subscribed, rather, to your Disney Plus service through Roku, or an Amazon Fire Stick, or an Apple TV, which I have about 6 of in this house between here and my businesses. If you signed up for Disney Plus through any one of those devices and through those services, they get a cut, usually around 15%. In fact, Roku's had some issues with this lately, I think with Amazon, if memory serves, which is why they've been having disagreements. So if you bought that through one of those services and you paid your $30, well, guess what? About $4.50 of that went to Apple, or to Roku, or to Amazon Prime, or whoever else is providing you the delivery device to have Disney Plus played on your television set. And the same thing goes with HBO Max and all these other content providers. They have to have a delivery device. But if you signed up for Disney Plus on your laptop, on your regular computer or whatever, that's a different story. But that being said, so when you look at this, they're not getting those return ticket sales. The people that bought it on Disney Plus are probably not going to go out and buy a copy on physical media. They're probably never going to make a purchase of this intellectual property ever again. And especially when it's going to be on Disney Plus for free in less than 90 days from now. So you really have to ask yourself, is this really working out? Or is this all a big taunt by Disney saying, look at the numbers we're getting on Disney Plus Premier Access. Yeah, theaters, we still have the power. We'll give it back to you when you agree to our terms. We don't know what's going on behind the scenes right now, but it would be interesting to be a fly on the wall inside AMC and Cinemark and Regal and some of these other companies that are probably negotiating with Disney. I would love to know what the terms were for Black Widow at this point, because I cannot imagine that these theaters are going to sit there and cough up the same amounts of revenue sharing that they were just a few years ago, just 2 years ago, as a matter of fact, back in 2019 with Disney. I can't imagine them doing that today. So that's just something to bear in mind. Now, on the heels of that, I also want to talk about Space Jam. Not really, not the movie, just the financial stuff. I don't care. I didn't watch it. I didn't know. Anyway, I have HBO Max. I could watch this right now for free, quote unquote free. I already have the subscription through my cable provider. I did that with The Conjuring, but I will be buying a copy of The Conjuring when it's available on 4K or Blu-ray, because I do enjoy the series. So that I'm going to spend money on that intellectual property. Unlike Cruella, unlike Black Widow, that'll be on Disney Plus for free. If I ever get around to watching them, which I may or may not, I don't care at this point. I don't need to spend any extra money. These are not movies that I really care that much about, but had they been in theaters exclusively, at least Black Widow, not so much Cruella, chances are I may have spent, with my family of 5, I may have spent $50, $60 going to the theater to see that. Space Jam wasn't even in the cards. I saw this movie back in 1995 or whenever it was made. It was fine back then. I saw no reason to remake it now, but it does give us an interesting story for the theatrical releases, because this afternoon, Samba TV came out with their official numbers on how many U.S. households watched Space Jam, and the numbers were eye-popping. Again, this is not an extra charge like Black Widow or Cruella or any of these Disney Premier Access. If you have HBO Max, you have access to this movie for the first 30 days, and then it will go into a brief hiatus, we'll call it, before it comes back probably later on. But it's in the theaters, and it did surprisingly well. Initial analyst estimates had this movie tracking to hit around 20 to 25 million. And it came in over 30. So it did very well. But what was stunning, 2.1 million households watch this movie on HBO Max. Now, if you take those numbers just in the U.S. and you translate that into a movie-going public, take about 3 people per household. I mean, that might have been another 40, 50 million in revenue for this movie. That movie, if everybody that watched it on HBO Max had to go see it in a theater, that movie would have equaled, perhaps beaten, Black Widow's first weekend. It's a little scary to think of. So just to kind of put it in perspective for you guys, to have even beaten F9 or been in the ballpark of those two movies would have been spectacular. Now, the question is, how many people just watched the movie on HBO Max because it was there and they didn't have to pay for it? That's a valid argument. And of course, that's almost impossible to tell unless somebody really dug in and did some survey numbers and had a big enough sample size to where I could buy into it. But it is possible to say that that movie got more attention than it did because it was just out there for free and people just figured, why not? But again, this goes back to showing you that there is lifeblood out there, that companies like Warner Brothers and Disney, they're just walking away from the theatrical revenue. And more importantly, they're walking away from the secondary, tertiary, all the other ancillary sales, the repeat sales of second viewings in the theater, the repeat sales of digital rentals, the repeat sales of that IP when it comes to DVDs, Blu-rays, 4Ks, things like this, or buying a digital copy later on after you already saw it in the theater. So again, this is one of those things I don't think is terribly sustainable long term, because none of these companies are all going to get to the point where they can continue to produce these levels of movies, these production budgets, and then still have enough revenue to justify that continued rate of burn. It's going to come to a head. But it seems like at this point, from what we know, Shang-Chi and the Eternals will be in theaters. I don't know if those are great movies to go back all the way into the theaters on. I think Black Widow would have been the one to do it on. They didn't want to do that because I just don't see Shang-Chi and the Eternals generating a ton of box office. And just like Black Widow, neither one of them are slated to open in China. Oops. So, any case, a lot of interesting stuff here, folks. But that being said, we're going to keep our eye on this. There's always more to the story than just the story itself. It's always about the timing of the story. What do the numbers mean? There's always some other implication in there one way or another, whether we like it or not. So until next time, I want to thank you all for being here. Please make sure you're subscribed to the channel. Please hit that like button. Share it out if you enjoyed this video. And until next time,